The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. This is Women Veterans, Understanding Reactions to Trauma and Developing Stress Resiliency. Now, this webinar is sponsored by the Rural Veterans Health Access Program and provided by the UAA Alaska Center for Rural Health and Health Workforce, which is the Alaska AHEC Program Office. All participants will be on mute during the presentation. If you wish to ask a question, you can type it into the question box at any time or email it to our AHEC at uaa_health_eductr@alaska.edu. A copy of today's presentation can also be downloaded from the Handouts tab in your sidebar. Now, we're joined today by Susan Maley. Susan is the Program Director for the Rural Veterans Health Access Program, who will tell us a little bit about the RVAP project and introduce our speaker. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Pat. And I'm so pleased that we have Vanessa Mead with us this afternoon. This is the last webinar that the Rural Veterans Program is doing, and so we'll be going out on a high note. The program has been federally sponsored through this month, and it is now providing telehealth counseling for all veterans, both urban and rural, and their families. And this is as of July 1st, and that's why I put this information on the introduction. And the reason for that change is that the federal funding was focused on rural, and now the contracted community mental health center can broaden the focus and provide the services for biofeedback, stress reduction, and other counseling. And just very briefly, we were one of 3 states, and ours was the only one to provide direct services. And I will then at the end give you a little more contact information. But now I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa. And Vanessa, I don't know if you want to go back to, or you have information about yourself further on.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you so much for having me here today, too. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. And Pat and Susan, I really appreciate everything you're doing for veterans and rural veterans.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I will just give a kind of short introduction of what I do, and that way you'll know who your speaker is today. So I do a few things, but one of the things I work at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. I work in the social work program there. I'm a clinical assistant professor there, and I teach a course specifically for military veterans, and working with military veterans and active duty as well as the families. So that's one of the pieces that I do there. And I also and we're working on developing veterans having more access to coming into the university in the School of Social Work, and getting more social workers that are veterans. So it's one of the projects that I'm working on as well. And we've been in some contact with JBEAR and some other of the active duty folks in order to try to make a bridge for people if they're wanting or interested in social work. So I also work with a nonprofit program that does mindfulness-based retreats for veterans, and I specifically work with women veterans in that as well. So it's just kind of a little bit of a background. I'm also a U.S. Army veteran. I am a Gulf War veteran, and the focus of my doctoral work was mindfulness-based interventions with women veterans. So that's just kind of a little rundown. And so I just also wanted to, I always appreciate whenever I'm particularly on a webinar to know kind of what are we going to be doing. So I've done the short introduction of me. The second thing we're going to be talking about is really talking about and looking at women veterans' experiences. And then we'll move into understanding reactions to trauma and developing stress resiliency will be kind of the wrap up. And then at the end, we'll also have time for questions and answers. If anybody wants to type in any, we can address those at the end. So we have time to do that. So one of the things that I want to also mention as part of my introduction is I use the term post-traumatic stress instead of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's kind of a language change in order to really help people understand that it's kind of a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances and the way we look at it, particularly in the programs I work in. I also do this work because I am a veteran, and it's really important for me to really give back to the veteran community, and also be able to provide services and things that are helpful for veterans and the community, and really connecting veterans to the community in ways that are helpful. So that's just another part of the introduction there. So let's talk about kind of women veterans generally in the United States, and then we'll be more specific to Alaska. So women veterans are actually the fastest growing veteran population in our country right now. There are over 2.2 million women veterans in the United States and Puerto Rico. And in Alaska, we have about 10,000 women veterans, and they make up 13.9% of the veteran population. And that was in 2014. It's actually probably increased a little bit since then, but that's the most recent data we have. So Alaska has the highest percentage of women veterans per capita in the country. We're tied with Virginia. We used to be ahead of Virginia, but Virginia's caught up a bit. So just in the last couple of years. But we do have the highest percentage of women veterans per capita in the United States. The state that has the most women veterans is California. And Alaska also has the highest percentage of male veterans per capita as well, just as another piece of identifying that. So within that population of the plus 10,000, we also have 335 identified as American Indian, Alaska Native. Unfortunately, there's some limitations with this data, because that's only people who check single race for their demographic. So if anybody checked more than one of those, then that isn't included in this data. So the data isn't actually accurate. We know that there are more than that who identify, more women than that identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. So that's one of the pieces that we just wanted to talk about as far as the diversity of our state, and ensuring that we're and that's one of the things that I'm working with the VA and trying to change, so that they're actually tracking those numbers in a more specific way. So, all right. So, and one of the things that comes along as far as there's different changes that have happened over the years, and this has just been the recent changes, because there's been a whole history of changes that affect women's military service from basically the Civil War on in our country. And one of the things that I always like to mention that a lot of people aren't aware of is kind of some of our famous Alaska women veterans that people may not know about. One of them is Mary Louise Rasmussen, and a lot of people aren't aware that she was a veteran. She died at the age of 102 several years ago, but she was, before she moved to Alaska and became kind of the philanthropist that she was as part of the Rasmussen Foundation and the Rasmussen family, she was a colonel in the Army, and the Women's Army Corps. She was also the director of the Women's Army Corps for I believe about 8 years, and so she was initially appointed and then appointed again by Kennedy. And so she served 2 terms, and a lot of people aren't really aware. And she also was integral in helping the military integrate, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. But she put Caucasian and African American women together and started working with everybody together, and it really set the precedent for integration in the military. So a lot of people aren't aware of her major role in women serving, and also just in a lot of the aspects of military service. So I wanted to mention that. And also there's people that people aren't aware of, like Sheila Balistreri, who retired from KTUU. She's a woman vet, and so just like to mention some of the people that more people may know here in the state that are women veterans too. So just recently in January 2016, and which actually didn't get implemented until later that year, was the combat specialties open to women. And they did kind of a preliminary, quote unquote, pilot project around that once the law was changed to where women could serve in combat specialties. And as part of that, they've pretty much found that it wasn't such a big deal that people thought it was going to be. And so they've opened up all combat arms, and there's been a lot in the military, about how women have passed Ranger School, Special Forces training, and all sorts of things like that too. So women are integrating into that. One of the things that you frequently hear about that is a lot of times you'll hear, well, not all women can do that, but the part of that too is not all men can do that either, and everybody kind of has to choose, and do what you can within the military. And so that was one of kind of the major arguments about that. So also in June 2016, there was an announcement by the Secretary of Defense that allowed transgender service members to serve openly. That was another major change that's happened recently in military service that has affected not just women, but women also. And from 2012 to 2015, and actually even continuing on, there was a widespread investigations regarding military sexual assault in the military, and there was a documentary film that came out. If you haven't had an opportunity to see that, it's called The Invisible War, and it really kind of documents the problems that occurred and were occurring and still occur in the military around that. Also in 2010, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell happened for gay, lesbian, bisexual service members, and so that was another change that happened as part of women's military service as well. All right, so some issues that women veterans face, and this is in our state and also throughout the country. Our women veterans, our suicide rates are more than double those of civilian women. Women veterans are 3 to 4 times more likely to become homeless than civilian women. And like we said earlier, with women veterans are the fastest growing population, and so it's also the fastest growing homeless population as well. A lot of the services haven't been able to adapt as quickly as what's needed for the influx of percentage of women veterans that are now getting out of the military, and so there's a lot more need for specific programs for women veterans. Approximately 35% of women veterans use VA services in Alaska, and so some of the statistics we also get aren't fully representing, but it's about 35% currently are using VA services, and that has gone up. I'm trying to think, I think from 2008 it was 26%, so there's been a pretty significant increase in the number of women who are using VA services. And another thing that women are facing is combat-related injuries and post-traumatic stress from combat zone deployments. So in addition to the issues that happen while people are serving, including military sexual assault, that's another kind of newer thing about women being in combat, and not that women haven't been in combat, but larger numbers. That's one of the kind of myths, is that women haven't been in combat, and they have been, that they just weren't in combat specific jobs in the military, but women have served in combat for a long time. So trauma-related issues with women veterans. Women veterans are twice as likely to develop PTS than male veterans, which is post-traumatic stress again. There's issues of complex trauma. One of the things that comes up particularly around military sexual trauma, is how women are seen as, or how women, whenever you join the military, it's like a family type environment. People are supposed to have your back. You're supposed to have other people's back. And so one of the issues that we frequently talk about with military sexual trauma with military members is the family-like atmosphere, and the added component of, if there is sexual assault that happens, of the kind of betrayal around that, and how that is so different than kind of civilian type. A lot of times women have to continue to work with people and those kinds of things too. So we just like to mention that too. So sexual harassment is also a piece of that. Beyond the physical aspect of military sexual trauma, there's sexual harassment. Again, combat deployments, and then there's also the pre-enlistment trauma that occurs. That's one of the reasons why they believe that women veterans are twice as likely to develop PTS, because there's more women that experience sexual abuse prior to joining the military, or abuse prior to joining the military. So that adds an extra layer whenever they join, and another incident or other incidents occur. So we've talked about kind of the things that women veterans face, and really kind of, this is one of my, Peter Levine does a lot of work with somatic work with people, of women, men who've experienced trauma. And this is a quote by him that I really like to bring up, because I think it's important to really also focus on the resiliency factor, which is what we'll move into next, is, you know, the ways to develop resiliency and to work with things that have happened. So the quote is, "Trauma is a fact of life. It does not, however, have to be a life sentence." So there's a lot of trauma and traumatic things that happen to people, and finding ways to work with those things is one of the primary ways of developing your own resiliency and really being able to work with things. You can't change what's happened, I like to say. You can't change what's happened, but you can transform how you respond to it. So we'll move on here to really kind of also talking about how trauma shows up in women veterans, and in women that may be a bit different than with men, because women tend to have more anxiety and depressive symptoms in relation to trauma. Men tend to have more anger and substance abuse issues. There are substance abuse issues with women as well, but a lot of times it comes out more in anxiety and depressive symptoms related to trauma. A lot of women don't feel seen or heard as veterans. So this also kind of, if you're already not feeling seen and heard, and you've had experiences that have happened in the military, then it's just more likely not to feel seen or heard even more. So there was a recent survey that was done, and it was by a Service Women's Action Network, and they said 76% of women veterans don't feel like they're seen or heard. So it's a really high statistic for, you know, a lot of times, you know, women frequently talk about, a lot of the women I work with frequently talk about being in situations where they're not recognized as being veterans. Sometimes there's veterans specific parking places, and this has actually happened even here in Anchorage. Some of the kind of home stores that you go to buy supplies to, they have a parking spot. And I had one woman call me that was very upset because as she was getting out of her car, somebody told her that she shouldn't be parking there without her husband. And so lots of those stories exist about women not feeling seen or heard or seen as veterans because of you know, because of the stigma around, you know, veterans being men, veterans, and particularly combat veterans being men. Oftentimes, women veterans receive different diagnoses than what men do. Men are more likely to get post-traumatic stress diagnoses than women are. And so for women, they often will receive personality disorder diagnosis. There's also been instances where women that I've spoken with too, whenever they reported like military sexual trauma that occurred, they got kicked out under mental health diagnosis, including personality disorders, and that really put up a barrier for them to be able to access services once they were out. So it's one of the things I like to bring up. And there's ways of getting those, of working with organizations to get those. I'm trying to think of the term they call it. Discharge. Thank you. Yeah, the discharge changed. So, so women veterans also don't seek help because of the way they were treated in the military, either when an assault happened or based on experiences. So, not trusting the help that's there is also something that frequently happens with women vets. And also, providers not understanding the complex nature of either the military sexual trauma or also women veterans' experiences in general. And the kind of environments that women, given sexism, racism, homophobia, and all of those kinds of things too that exist. So, all right, so let's talk here about how we can work with things that have happened in a way that is developing resiliency and being able to manage stress in a different kind of way. So one of the things that we frequently talk about that's really important is self-regulation. And basically what this means is the ability to handle emotions in a way that's more productive than destructive, is the way I like. And there's this window of tolerance that we like to work with people on in order to be able to kind of be able to regulate. And a lot of body-based practices really work with these things, and that's one of the things that has been shown to be, along with therapy, there's different therapies as well, but being able to have a combination of therapy and body-based therapy as well. So to kind of go into talking about that, with hyperarousal, which is kind of there's the window of tolerance in the middle, or if you want to think of it, it's been compared to like a river. The window of tolerance is the river, and then there's two banks on each side. And so one of the banks is hyperarousal, and that's kind of on the top bank of a river, and that's where people have increased sensation, emotional reactivity, hypervigilance. There may be intrusive imagery that people have in their thoughts or that come up, disorganized cognitive processes. So that's kind of the hyperarousal part. And that's, and you think about it, hyper, increased activity. So on the other side of that, on the other shore, is hypo arousal. And these are both responses to trauma. And in the hypo arousal, there's basically people kind of shut down. There's an absence of sensation, numbing of emotions, unable to really cognitively process. It's not just disorganized, it's shut down, and then reduced physical movement. So what we're really working with the body-based types of therapies and activities is to be able to engage in that kind of middle, the river, which is the window of tolerance. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that here, what that means. So this is your kind of the optimal arousal zone. You can go in and out of this window of tolerance, but a lot of times if we've experienced trauma, we're not able to really find that middle space. We kind of fluctuate very quickly between the hypo and the hyper, or some people may just be stuck in hypo or hyper. So those things are pretty common whenever the trauma has happened. So it can vary from person to person, even situation to situation with the same person. So being able to, go to understand where your window is in relation to events that happen, or maybe, what's called triggers that occur, or those kinds of things are really important. Another term that's used often is the threshold of response. And this is basically when you're in a situation where there's a certain amount of stimulation that needs to happen or that happens to provoke a reaction instead of a response. So if we're extremely stressed about situations, our threshold of response is pretty minimal. If we have a lot of things that are happening in our lives, we have maybe there's work stress or family stress, or maybe we didn't sleep enough the night before, and we know that if we are kind of in those spaces, then we're more likely to be able to kind of engage in our response versus our reactivity of giving ourselves kind of a break when something happens instead of stepping into that hypo or hyper way of responding. So really identifying and working with triggers. One of the things I talk about frequently being in Alaska, and I talk about this with veterans, is, we have, in Alaska, we have, the small planes that have tundra tires on them. And those tundra tires are these big, huge rubber tires that land on tundra and are able to, so that you don't have to have an airstrip. Well, if you're in one of those planes and you're coming down to land on something, you touch down first and then take off again. You don't fully land on something. So I really talk about working with trauma and working with this window of tolerance and arousals and stuff as, you land on it for as long as you can, and then you take off again. And and there's all sorts of ways to be able to take off. Sometimes it takes distracting yourself if you can become too overwhelmed. The whole idea behind this is really not overwhelming your system. And if you do feel overwhelmed, finding something that can help you get back in that window of tolerance. So feeling stable and safe is what the idea is in the window of tolerance. And again, we're going to come in and out of it sometimes, but being able to, as quickly as we can and as kindly as we can, getting ourselves back in that middle kind of ground is kind of the goal of a lot of this work. All right, so practices to connect with this window of tolerance and being able to identify it, because a lot of times if there's been trauma that's occurred, we don't even know what it feels like to be in that center place or that middle place of the river where we are able to handle emotions and situations with a response versus a reaction. So a lot of things that really help with being able to identify different comfort in our body, feeling safe in our bodies, all of those kinds of things are yoga and other body practices. There's Qigong, Tai Chi, all sorts of things that people engage in to be able to really kind of start to develop that ability to know, not just in the mind what's happening and to hook into that, but also feeling what's happening in the body so that we can respond to things and know that, oh, hey, I'm getting activated, and what can I do right now to really kind of drop that activation level? Or, I'm checked out. How can I bring myself back into checking in? So meditation and mindfulness is also one of those practices that can help with that. Again, cautioning about the overwhelm. It's not something that's meant to a lot of times if we've served in the military, we tend to want to try to fix things quickly and to get to okay, let's get through this and get this done. And working with trauma and traumatic experiences is not something that you really want to take time with it. You want to find support, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But just really not overwhelming your system or yourself as you're starting to develop this kind of foundation of safety through the practices of like yoga and other body-based practices. So taking time to develop safety, just kind of moved right into that, learning limits and places to expand. So sometimes we have these limits that we've placed on ourselves that aren't necessarily true, but it's what we think they're true. So it's a really delicate process of being able to know what your actual limits are. And then also if there's maybe a perceived limit that you might be able to work with a little bit more on something, is to expand that. So having somebody to work with, a therapist, is a really important aspect as you're developing the safety, doing these practices and things like that. It's a really helpful thing to have somebody that kind of you can talk about with your limits and places you can expand so that you don't overwhelm yourself and you have support, because that's the number one thing too, is finding your allies and finding support in the work that you're doing. So being able to identify body sensations, thoughts, and emotions, again, this is something that a lot of times if you've been either hyper or hypo, either way, it's a really difficult thing to start to do. Sometimes we've explained it as it's kind of like a dimmer switch, that you don't want to turn it up all the way right away, but just, if there's been things that have happened that you're not engaged in having basically contact with body sensations and what's happening in the body, then just taking it really slow. And giving yourself, or if you're working with other people around this window of tolerance of things, is really allowing choice, and that people have full choice in how they do that. And acknowledging the small steps that are made to make that kind of connection. Because we tend to think of, a lot of times, I know my background and training in social work and psychology has pretty much been about mind and things like that, and we don't do a really good job of training people around, the somatic aspect, which we're, more and more research is coming to find that the body is speaking to the brain just as much, if not more, than the brain is speaking to the body. So being able to really put those things together. So other ways to activate the parasympathetic response to regulate arousal, there's lots of things that can be done to do that, including breath work, which if you're in hypo, you can actually use breath work, and again, using and working with somebody who has somatic background and somatic experience to speed up your breath in order to engage that parasympathetic system that's shut down. Or if you're in hyper, of working with breath in a much slower way to engage it differently if you're breathing fast than to slow it down. So the parasympathetic system is what is basically, you know, we have the sympathetic that responds whenever something's happening, that is, we feel like it's an emergency, needs to happen, something needs to happen, we need to, you know, get away, then that kicks in, and the parasympathetic is what calms things back down. If we've had a lot of traumatic things happen, it tends to kind of get stuck in that sympathetic response without there being a way to calm down that system to get it, you know, to activate the parasympathetic. So it's really what we're working on in developing this window of tolerance of being able to do those practices that get us back to that. And then self-monitoring, that's one of the things of just throughout the day, checking in. Am I, you know, checked out, or am I overly, you know, am I hyper in my arousal right now, as far as you know, not being able to think clearly, you know, the different aspects of hyperarousal, or am I checked out in a hypoarousal? And then, you know, being able to activate some of these, maybe it's doing some yoga stretches, maybe it's doing some meditation, or you know, basically finding some connection that helps you kind of get back into that window of tolerance in the moment, so that you're able to, again, you know, it's about being able to respond to situations instead of being reactive, because if we're stuck in that sympathetic response, then we tend to stay there and react versus respond. And really, you know, with neuroscience and what we know, being able to connect to those things really, and practice these things, helps us develop a quicker kind of like right now we may have a superhighway to hyperarousal or a hypo, and we can kind of create a new road to go down, and we have to practice those things. It's kind of like I always talk about, you know, you can go to the gym and look at the weights, but you're not going to get a workout. So you have to really, you know, practice these things that help us develop this resiliency, and being able to develop resiliency in how we're responding to situations. And you know, one of the things that's used, there's the Heart Math Institute has what's called M-Waves, and they're a biofeedback, and I know that there's programs here in Alaska that are using those. I believe Susan's program is using that. Do you want to speak about that just for a moment?
Yes, thank you. The Heart Math is using now a newer version of the M-Wave, which is something that connects to your cell phone and has an app. So, and that's Inner Balance, and it's extremely easy to use, and what it's doing with a clip on your ear is measuring heart rate variability, and then connecting that with a breath monitor. And so it's different than the diaphragmatic breathing of meditation, and certainly both of them are calming. But there's a lot of literature about heart rate variability and what its effects are for chronic pain, hyperarousal, hypertension. And there's some identifying information for me at the end, and I'm happy to share any information, either journal article or the brochure that we put together about biofeedback and stress reduction.
And that really helps people be in that. It's a device that can help people identify like when they're in that kind of optimal zone, which is kind of that window of tolerance that we've been talking about too.
Right, and we've had veterans say this is the tool I use most in my toolbox, and it's one I can use anywhere. And whether that's for chronic pain or stress or PTS, whatever.
Yeah. So, you know, the things to talk about as far as developing and maintaining resiliency, some of these things are, whether you're a provider or you're a woman veteran, some of these things are kind of common sense, and it's stuff that we quote unquote should be doing, but we often don't do it. So I like to put this slide up just as a reminder of the things that really help us develop and maintain resiliency as we're dealing with situations in our lives. So, you know, connection with family and friends, sometimes even when you don't want to. Because maybe you want to go home, maybe you just don't want to deal with people, but really if that becomes kind of the pattern for the way you're interacting, then understanding that that's, you know, connection with friends and family has been one of the things that's really shown to be one of the most helpful things in resiliency. So sometimes even when you don't want to, once you start to do that, I don't know, I've done that before, you know, you don't feel like going out to dinner with friends, and then once you do it, like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I did that. And so when your initial response may be to, oh, I'm tired, go home, or I don't want to leave the house, or whatever that is. So eating well is another huge thing. Making sure that you're eating, fruits and veggies and doing the nutrition aspect of things, because that's one of the things that's also been shown to really be helpful for resiliency and also stress, managing stress. Really looking at how flexible you are in day-to-day life, having some flexibility around things. One of the things about military training and military service is that things are set out, and there's ways that there's flexibility, but there's also a lot of things that are kind of planned, things that are, and that's one of the things I hear often as people are transitioning out of the military is, that's it feels like it's inconsistent, or civilian life doesn't feel as structured as military life does. So really working on and starting to develop that flexibility and ability to be flexible, not just in situations as far as what's happening, but also mentally. How flexible are we in being able to kind of step out of judgment and step out of either of ourselves or others, and sometimes we're way more judgmental of ourselves than we are even of other people, but being able to go, okay, I need to really, look at this in a way that's more flexible versus concrete, and there's only one way, because that really creates a lot of stress. Using humor is one of the things that's really helpful, being able to kind of not make fun of, but also being able to kind of laugh at ourselves sometimes, not take ourselves so seriously. That's a really important aspect. Open-mindedness, being able to be open-minded. Again, a lot of these seem very simple, but it's just a reminder of what we know, because sometimes we need to be reminded of what we need to do, that we know we should be doing. So facing our fears in a way that's not overwhelming. Again, being able to look at the things that we're worried about or that we're afraid of, and work with those things, and also, again, working with a support system and a support team, and that is really important. Spirituality is one of the things. Really connecting with spirituality, whatever your spiritual beliefs are, and working with that is another aspect that really helps maintain and develop resiliency. Regular exercise is one of the ones that is really, and there's actually some studies being done about how when people transition out of the military they either there's kind of two camps in that. People tend to either continue to exercise, or they completely drop off and don't do anything after being made to do that for so many years, or for the military service. So really looking at maintaining that regular exercise, and what they're looking at is how that impacts mood of people that aren't exercising after they get out. And we know from studies around depression and stuff that regular exercise is one of the best things that you can do, and it's hard to do if you're depressed, but it's one of the best things you can do for depression, is really being able to move and get moving in whatever way you can around that. Again, mindfulness, formal and informal practices. So I'll just kind of go into a little explanation of what that means. So kind of like what we talked about with going to the gym. More formal practices are sitting meditation, being able to, walking meditation, those types of things, which I won't go into detail, but there's a lot online about. And the informal practices are really being able to be aware of being in the present throughout the day. So your formal practices kind of help you carry over into the informal practice of, when you're at a stop sign, are you really, or if in the shower in the morning, are you in the shower, or are you already at work? And being able to notice how often we're actually checked out, even without trauma, that we're always, because that's how we've survived, is being able to think ahead. But it's also not really helpful for being able to respond to things instead of react. So really developing a practice of noticing when you aren't present, so that you can kind of bring yourself back to presence. And there's ways of doing that, like I said, of having different reminders around. I've used with people using white dots, like little stickers that you put on things that you use a lot, and you take 3 breaths with those things, so they just really connect with that. Or you're driving, you're at a stoplight, instead of sitting there waiting and going, when is the light going to change, when is the light going to change, really feeling the steering wheel, maybe taking 3 breaths, whatever it is that kind of helps you be where you're at versus where you're going or where you were just left from. So sleeping well, another huge one. Being able to sleep well is huge in maintaining resiliency and developing resiliency. So if there's sleep issues, getting those checked out and make sure that you're able to get as much sleep as you can with the circumstances that you're in. There's people have sleep apnea and all sorts of things that also affect things. So if you are having sleep problems, making sure that you get some help around that, because that really helps you be able to again connect with that parasympathetic aspect of living. So unplugging, creating time and space away from electronics. We didn't used to have to worry about this so much for those of us that are older, but now we really, it seems like you have to really create time to be unplugged, and it's a really important thing to be able to unplug from that instant communication, that instant news feed that's telling you every 2 seconds something that's happening in another part of the world, or that tends to also stress us out. So figuring out ways to unplug in ways that you can, that are that then you're being instead of doing. Also set limits and boundaries, and this means on your time and on activities. So sometimes people need to say no more, and sometimes other people need to say yes more. So if you're a person that likes to not do so much, and that's kind of your go-to place, then maybe saying yes more. But if you're a person that's always trying to do more and more things, saying no and really setting and creating time for yourself is an important aspect. Again, the practices around yoga and other body-based practices are really important, and developing a support team. This is really huge, whether it's therapists, friends, family, community members, church members, whatever it is really having connection to a support team. It's one of the things that veterans often talk about as being one of the most difficult things after they've left military service, is really having a sense of community and being with other people who you have a common goal. You have, there's kind of with military service a feeling or a sense of serving something much larger than yourself, and so a lot of people really feel like that's lacking when they get out. So being able to develop and learn ways in civilian life that people can connect with service is a really important piece too. Also, limiting exposure to violence. This is one I like to mention, because a lot of times there's video games, there's movies, TV, everything that really can, especially if you've been in combat situations, or you've been in situations that keep you kind of in that fight, flight, or freeze situation that we were talking about with the sympathetic, response, of it really limiting your exposure to that, because it really helps being able to not continue on that reactive pattern. So I just like to mention that one as well. I know a lot of people play video games and things like that may also keep us activated versus being able to develop more of a response to situations. So, and be resilient in that. All right, so I'm looking at the time here, and I'd just like to take just like 2 minutes to quickly do mindfulness practice. Just like I said, 2 minutes. It's going to be very simple, but just as a way to, we've been talking and a lot of heady stuff, and I always like to bring in, the practices that I talk about into presentations. So if you're able to sit in an upright and comfortable position, if it's comfortable for you to allow your eyes to close, or if it's not comfortable, just glancing down. And we're just going to do a simple practice of noticing what you're sitting on. Noticing any sensations of the chair or the couch or the floor or whatever it is that you're sitting on. Just feeling that support of that chair underneath you. And maybe you don't feel any sensation or any sensation in sitting, and that's okay too. But just if you can, however much is showing up for you right now, just noticing. What it's like to be sitting right here. You may notice some thoughts that are happening. That's a lot of people think with meditation and mindfulness that the idea is to stop your thoughts. That's absolutely not the case. Your thoughts are going to keep going, but what you can do is just not hook into those thoughts and just come back to, again, any sensation of sitting when you notice that your mind has wandered. Noticing that contact with the chair or whatever you're sitting on, and maybe contact with your feet on the floor or wherever they are, whatever contact they're in. Not trying to make anything different in your sitting, just being with what is. Maybe you're noticing tiredness, or sitting still isn't normal for you. Just noticing that and coming back to any sensations of sitting. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and open your eyes and glance back up. But can you right now, just knowing that that's going to shift and change, still be where you're at? So allowing the eyes to open, glancing back up, maybe looking at something in the room where you're sitting. And just noting any changes that may or may not have happened in just that short little practice. There may be none, you may notice something, so just noting that for yourself. All right, so as we get ready to wrap up here, simple ways to develop awareness, connection to daily living activities, like I said, being able to connect with being in the present as you're doing daily things instead of being in the past or in the future, and just noticing and coming back, building your support, your team, your support team, and maintaining that, promoting, doing activities that promote wellness and connection, and also, if you are working with difficult things, or you are a therapist, so if you're working with things, finding a therapist if you don't already have one that has experience with, somatic work can be helpful, or meditation, mindfulness, or any of those aspects. And if you're a therapist that are, really developing, maybe receiving additional training to include that in your practice with people. So here are the references that I used for the presentation today, and I believe Susan has a couple of things to go over here, and then we can get to questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I think this was such meaningful information and provides so many different tools and directions for people to explore. And as you say, making connections with themselves and with others. So just very briefly, I want to go over what I'd mentioned before, that the pilot project stage has now completed. So the telecounseling services, which involve biofeedback, and for the first 100 veterans who are engaging in this after July 1st, the biofeedback devices themselves will be free. And that's through Sitka Counseling with funding that has been provided by the Rural Veterans Program. But now those services and devices are available to urban veterans, rural veterans, and urban and rural veterans family members. And this includes people who aren't eligible for VA healthcare, and that's over 50% of Alaska veterans, as well as those who are enrolled. And the VA is in the process now of working out how they will pay for the biofeedback devices for people who are enrolled. So what the services are that are being provided through Sitka Counseling, and that's a community mental health center that has experience with trauma-informed care and counselors that are trained and certified in biofeedback. And those 3 dot points, the first 2 are the direct services, and the third one is the webinar presentations that we've just done one of. And there's a link to this webinar and the past ones. I should tell you, it'll probably be a couple of weeks before this webinar is up, and there'll be a YouTube link for an audio and also the PowerPoint presentation that Vanessa has given. So if anyone needs more information, here is the contact links for the website and for me. And now I'm going to pass it back. I'll leave that up, but pass it back to Vanessa to have more discussion and question and answers.
Well, we do have time for questions right now. There are none yet in our queue, so if you have any questions for either Vanessa or Susan, make sure to type them into your question pod and we will address them now. If we don't get to them, remember you can email them to us at the UAA_AK health eductr@alaska.edu. While people may be typing in, any last words?
Well, I just really appreciate everybody who did attend the webinar and also the invitation from you to present. It's really, it's an honor to be here and to be able to present on a topic that's very close to my heart and working with women veterans and, and also being a woman veteran myself. So.
And while we're waiting for a question, and I think that's it, the combination of your life experience and training is what makes this such a valuable presentation. And I have a question, which is, having heard you talk about the somatic therapies, and you mentioned Peter Levine, who I think I know I'm familiar with his name, but in looking at how the body stores trauma and the neurobiology of stress, which is something that biofeedback, mindfulness, exercise, all connect with. I wonder if you have a few things to say about that, because I think that's such helpful information for people to understand. As you were saying, it's like building a new road, and there's that phrase, what fires together wires together. So, that's part of rebalancing from trauma.
Yeah. So Peter Levine's work, I haven't actually been trained in his modality, but he has a practice that he teaches people who are body workers, therapists, different things like that, and it's called Somatic Experiencing. And so there's different types of somatic work. There's all different kinds of it, from somatic experiencing. EMDR can be considered a body practice as well. There's different modalities and different things, and so different things work for different people. Mm-hmm. And so really exploring what works for you and what creates the most safety for you and as you're doing therapy is a really important aspect of that. And so, there's Bessel van der Kolk also has a great book, The Body Keeps the Score. And that's not just written for therapists, it's also written for people who are interested in or have experienced trauma, and kind of explains in a very down-to-earth way of how trauma affects us. And that it's not abnormal to have trauma. But the way we work with it is the important aspect, and being able to, it's not just a mind thing, it's not just something we think, that the body actually holds a lot of the things that we've experienced, and there's ways of working with that to where that kind of tension or that kind of experience is released in a different sort of way than cognitive therapy can provide.
And the only thing we have is a thank you from Nicole.
Okay.
It was great. And Rudy also says thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Nicole and Rudy.
Well, since we have no other questions, then I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and also Vanessa and Susan for their presentations. Now, certificates for social work contact hours or attendance will be sent in a follow-up email in the next couple of days to everyone who requested them. The webinar is now over, and everyone may disconnect, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all. Thank you all.